Let's take a look at the Fordist organization. Describing organizations as Fordist captures a shorthand way the dominant organizational form of the 20th century. Named after industrialist Henry Ford, Fordism is understood as the emergence and dominance of mass production organization and the development of principles that would shape people's lives for most of the 20th century. Fordism was capitalism's response to the threats that were posed by Marx and others. What were these principles, and why were they important in re-establishing the legitimacy of capitalism? Fordism involved a technical revolution in which the very nature of work was transformed, going through what might be termed a process of rationalization, the application of rational principles to make work as productive as possible. Work under Fordism was characterized by extreme division of labor. Rather than having a skilled worker complete a number of tasks, many workers each completed a single, repetitive task. In many respects, the classic Fordist, large-scale industrial organization was characterized by a highly centralized decision-making system, a strong hierarchical structure, and a low level of trust between workers and managers. One of the main features of the Fordist organization was its ability to produce vast quantities of products. Everything was done on a large scale. In addition to fundamentally changing the technical nature of work in the 20th century, Fordism also was the catalyst for a social-political revolution that changed the way that most people live their lives. In this sense, Fordism refers not simply to how corporations operated, but also to a broader system of principles and societal values that shaped how people thought about themselves as both workers, citizens, and consumers. Under Fordism, capitalism was shaped by a philosophy that attempted to manage the boom and bust economic cycles of primitive capitalism, and that also attempted to reduce some of the disparity between rich and poor. One of the key features of Fordism was the creation of an economic system in which work was a relatively stable and secure part of many workers' lives. For perhaps the first time in human history, the idea of a career was available to the average worker. Many workers spent their entire working lives employed by a single company and on retirement received a company pension. Work in the Fordist organization was clearly separated from other aspects of life. There was a strong sense in which work was a 9-to-5 task that could be left behind once the workday was over. One of the most important aspects of Fordism was the creation of a consumer society. In summary, we can say that Fordism was both a particular mode of work and organizing and a particular form of life. The development of scientific management principles and their application was a key ingredient in the Fordist organization. Indeed, part of Ford's initial success was the marriage of Taylor's principles and the moving assembly line. Below, we'll discuss the system of work organization that Taylor developed. As an engineer at the Midvale Steel Company in Pennsylvania, Taylor spent his entire professional career attempting to develop more efficient ways to work. Starting in 1880 and continuing for 26 years, Taylor performed between 30,000 and 50,000 experiments on steel cutting alone. The development and implementation of the principles of scientific management, however, were by no means simply a technological issue. More than anything else, Taylor's system addressed the relations between employers and employees. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Taylor was confronted with a work environment characterized by high levels of antagonism between workers and managers. Taylor referred to this deliberate restriction of output by workers as systematic soldiering, a problem he saw as the central problem in the workplace. In developing his principles of scientific management, Taylor's objective was to replace this old system of ordinary management with a rational system rooted in sound scientific principles. Taylor outlines 4 basic principles of scientific management. Scientific job design. Each element of the work task is designed according to scientific principles, thus replacing the old rule-of-thumb method of ordinary management. Scientific selection and training of individual workers. Each worker is matched to the job for which he or she is best suited and then trained in the necessary skills. Cooperation between management and workers. In order to ensure that all the work is being done corresponds to scientific management principles, managers supply a supportive environment that provides workers with a sense of achievement. Equal division of work between management and workers. Under this principle, management assumes the responsibility for scientifically designing tasks and planning ahead. Taylor argues that the only way in which these principles can be enacted on is through what he calls a complete mental revolution. In this course, we'll examine the human relations school of work and organization. In his early work on industrial relations, Elton Mayo argued that the experience of the average worker in industry ran parallel to the experience of post-traumatic stress victims during wartime. In other words, the workplace produced an extreme sense of alienation in the worker, leading to a form of negative revere and a detachment from the work environment. Mayo's answer to this problem was to propose that, through counseling, workers could be psychologically adjusted to their work and thus experience it as meaningful and worthwhile. Mayo saw the workplace, specifically one's occupational group, as the primary medium for the creation of human identity. Mayo argued that the industrialization process had destroyed the tight social bonds between workers, thus alienated individuals from the social world. Just as Taylor saw his system of scientific management as having ramifications well beyond the workplace, we see the same with Mayo. For him, the development of a cooperative system in the industrial workplace had implications for the social system as a whole. He saw the widespread industrial and social conflict of his day as the product of political agitators and politicians who exploited class antagonisms. Mayo argued that the development of an administrative elite who could instill corporate principles. The Hawthorne studies were conducted from 1924 to 1933 at the Western Electric Hawthorne plant in Cicero, Illinois. In a series of experiments, some lasting many years, researchers attempted to investigate the effects on employee behavior and attitudes of a variety of physical, economic, and social variables. Carried out by Hawthorne engineers, these experiments were intended to discover the effects of variation in lighting on employee productivity. Using two groups of workers, the researchers gradually increased the level of illumination in one group, the experimental group, while keeping illumination constant in the other, the control group. In all other ways, the two groups were identical. In keeping with their initial hypothesis, the researchers found that the productivity of the experimental group increased along with the level of illumination. Strangely, however, the productivity of the control group increased as well. Furthermore, even when the researchers began to decrease the level of lighting in the experimental group back to its original level, productivity continued to go up. It even continued to increase as the lighting fell below normal levels. Only at the point when lighting levels were extremely low did worker productivity drop. The researchers were baffled by these results. Clearly, some variable other than the level of illumination had caused the increased production level. Some of the researchers speculated that participation in the experiment might be having some kind of effect on the workers, encouraging increased output. To investigate this alternative hypothesis, a second set of studies was set up. Again, the researchers concluded that increased productivity levels could be attributed mainly to the new supervisory system. In later years, this phenomenon, in which workers respond to the personal attention paid to them by supervisors, became known as the Hawthorne effect. For the first time, social scientists seem to have established the significance of the human element in the work process. Workers appeared to be motivated not merely by economic incentives, but also by their experience of and attitudes towards the work process itself. What workers were thinking and feeling while working became subject of intense scrutiny. Although there's plenty of critique, and we'll go to that next, the research of Mayo and his colleagues had a profound influence on the course of research in organizations for the next several decades. Unlike Taylor, Mayo argued that group cohesiveness could lead to a more cooperative and productive workforce. This discovery of informal work group was a catalyst for several decades of research on small group relations. While classical theorists argued that informal communication was largely detrimental to the functioning of organizations, the human relations movement emphasized its positive social aspects and its contribution to worker satisfaction. The Hawthorne effect seemed to suggest a great deal of untapped potential in terms of managers' abilities to motivate workers. A happy worker is a productive worker became a mantra for the human relations movement. Impetus for leadership research. With Mayo's emphasis on the importance of administrative elites appropriately trained in techniques of social control, later researchers attempted to establish the criteria for good leadership. The Hawthorne researchers were among the first to utilize naturalistic, qualitative methods in the workplace. The Hawthorne studies, coupled with Mayo's political philosophy, seemed to provide a solution to the intense industrial conflict that was pervasive in terms of a feature of the workplace in the 1920s and 30s. However, it quickly became apparent that there were a number of limitations to the Hawthorne studies. We can divide the criticisms of the Hawthorne studies into two categories. First, the studies were critiqued on empirical grounds. A number of commentators argued that when the Hawthorne data were subject to scrutiny, the researchers' claim of a connection between satisfaction and productivity didn't hold water. Second, the Hawthorne findings have been critiqued on ideological grounds, as commentators have questioned the studies, or more accurately Mayo's, highly conservative vision of worker management relations. Management history typically views Hawthorne as a revolutionary paradigm shift. A view of workers as purely economically motivated is replaced with a much more humane vision of a worker as part of an organic community. Human relations theory was never about changing the nature of work itself. Mayo was not interested in making structural changes to organizations by, for example, making work more meaningful or participatory. Thus, the early human relations movement was heavily paternalistic in its view of the average worker, with little interest in making real changes in the quality of workers' lives. Rather, the goal was to adjust workers' attitudes to existing organizational conditions. As such, human relations theory did nothing to change the strongly hierarchical structure of existing organizations. While scientific management took the worker's body as the focal point of control efforts, human relations theory focused on the psychology of the worker, his or her attitudes and feelings about work. Thus, control practices shifted from body to mind, but with little or no change in the nature of work itself. Indeed, it might be said that the human relations theory did not replace scientific management, but rather complemented it with efforts to mentally adjust workers to the industrial labor process. This theory was arguably a force in the affirmation of the status quo at a time of considerable industrial and political unrest. The years following World War II were boom years for the U.S. economy and marked the modern organization. As markets expanded and a stable, growing economy and full employment became the norm, so the large-scale corporate bureaucracy came into its own. In this reality, the manager possesses the skills necessary, rationalizing work, long-term planning, marketing, product standardization, leading employees, and so on, to enable the organization to maximize its profits and grow. However, this period of a stable, growing economy and full employment also created a problem from a managerial perspective. While in the early days of capitalism, coercion and threats were enough to motivate employees, this was no longer the case. The 1920s and the 1930s had witnessed labor struggles, a Great Depression, and the creation of New Deal legislation that limited conflicts between workers and management. Stable, well-paid employment and strong unionization meant that management could no longer simply use coercion or threat of firing to motivate employees. This shift in the political context for the arrival of human resource management on the organization's scene. HRM is usually framed as a genuine effort to motivate workers by recognizing their value to the organization, their human resources, or human capital. And this idea is certainly true in part. But what is often overlooked is that human resource management is also a response to a legitimately crisis in management. That is, managers appeared to have little influence over the motivation and productivity of workers. Employees saw work as the place where they took care of their lower level needs, but not as a place where their higher order needs were satisfied. These were reserved for life with friends and loved ones. HRM represents an attempt to tap into higher order needs and make work relevant to achievement of potential.